It was the way he said it. Not loud, not cruel, but final. It felt as if someone had gently shut a door that I was unaware was about to close. You don't need a room here. The statement was uttered in a mere 6 words. Spoken while holding his car keys, glancing at the clock as if we were confirming something mundane, like a bill had been paid or groceries were already in the fridge. I remember standing in the hallway, my overnight bag still looped around my wrist. I had come to stay for a few days after my doctor's appointment, still woozy from the sedative. I thought it would be like before, like it had always been, but the guest room door was shut. There was a jacket hanging on the back of it, not mine, a suitcase in the corner. The scent of an unfamiliar perfume wafted through the room. I stood there for a few seconds, unsure. Then he said it, just like that. You don't need a room here. I'm Eliza Hartley, 71 years old. That was the moment I knew I was no longer someone who belonged. Subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Thanks. I remember my hand tightening slightly on the strap of the bag. It was just enough to make a noticeable difference. I didn't cry. I didn't ask. I stepped back into the kitchen and poured a glass of water. I sipped it slowly, despite my dry throat and stomach. I stayed the night on the couch. Not because there wasn't a bed, but because there wasn't one meant for me anymore the next morning. I left before the house woke up, and I didn't go home not right away. I drove to the edge of town and parked near the old elementary school where I used to volunteer. I sat in the lot with the windows cracked open, watching the wind lift the flag on the pole, thinking about all the years I had given. All the birthdays are remembered. The meals are made. The errands are run. The advice is offered, and only sometimes taken. There's no room left now. He was my only child, born in the middle of winter. One of those fierce, ice-wrapped Januaries where even the hospital windows seemed to groan with cold. The nurse placed him in my arms and said, "He's a strong one," and I believed her. He had that furrowed brow from the start. Like the world had handed him questions before he was ready for answers. I raised him mostly on my own. My husband left when our son was 6. One morning, he just packed the car and said it wasn't working anymore. He didn't mean the marriage. He meant life. So I made a life for the 2 of us. It wasn't glamorous. I worked mornings at the library and cleaned. Offices at night. On Saturdays, I'd let him sleep in while I packed lunches for the week. I made a ritual out of simple things: apple slices fanned out like petals, sandwiches cut into shapes, and socks warmed on the radiator before school. He never knew I skipped meals sometimes, so he wouldn't feel the difference. I don't say that to be noble, just truthful. Love for me was never about grand gestures. It was about ensuring that he never experienced the coldness I felt. I remember the year he had pneumonia. I sat beside his bed for 3 nights straight, holding a bowl of steam under his nose and whispering stories, till his breathing smoothed out. When he was 13 and wanted a bike that cost too much, I sold my wedding band at a pawn shop. He never asked how I got the money. He just said thank you and rode the bike until the tires wore down. When he left for college, I didn't cry until after the car pulled away. I repainted his room that weekend just to keep my hands busy. Left the closet untouched. Some part of me thought he'd need it again. When he came home for the holidays, I stocked his favorite cereal, bought the expensive coffee, folded his laundry without saying a word about how full my joints were feeling. And when he married, I made peace with being the mother-in-law. I was gracious. I didn't interfere. I offered help when asked and stayed quiet when not. I babysat when they had meetings, cleaned when they were overwhelmed, took the night shift with the baby even after my back had started to go. I never kept track. I didn't believe in measuring what you give to your children, but I remember every detail now. Not because I regret it, I don't, but because it deserves to be remembered. When they traveled, I stayed in the house to water the plants and feed the cats. I left small notes on the fridge, little things like milk's running low or your son said the sweetest thing today. They never wrote back. They started saying things like, "You don't have to come over and we've got it covered." It was subtle at first. A missed invitation. A birthday celebrated elsewhere. A holiday plan made without checking in. Still, I kept showing up. I brought pies to every gathering, sent texts just to say good morning, left their favorite tea bags in the cupboard. When my grandson turned 8, he drew a picture of the family. I wasn't in it. He said there wasn't enough space on the page. I said it was beautiful. This is what we tend to do, isn't it? We let ourselves be trimmed out of the picture so the frame doesn't feel too crowded. But now, when I sit with those memories, I wonder if I had asked for more, would they have seen me? Or was it easy to forget I was there because I never did anything? It's not the big betrayals that hollow you out. It's the little ones. It's the ones you carry in silence because they sound petty when said out loud. You rationalize them away to safeguard your pride than theirs. I used to write down my grandson's school events in a notebook I kept on the counter. For years, I never missed a single one. Every science fair, every costume parade, every lukewarm auditorium seat for a recorder recital. Then one day I showed up, and the teacher said they were here earlier, left just after his part. No one had told me. No one had even thought to. That was a Tuesday. I remember because I made a casserole that morning, thinking they'd be too tired to cook after. I left it on their doorstep with a note, proud of him, as always. They never said thank you. I told myself it was fine, that they were busy. I told myself that every time I was left off a group text. Every time I learned about a trip from someone else's photos, I was left out. Every time my calls went to voicemail and weren't returned for days, if at all. The neglect was characterized by silence rather than slaps or slurs. I was still invited to birthdays. But I was always invited to swing by if you're free. Decisions no longer involved me. Little things. Like when they switched the Thanksgiving menu or gave away the bookshelf I had left in the front room to make space. They didn't mean to hurt me, sure, but carelessness cuts just the same as cruelty. One morning, I came over to return a baking dish and heard my name mentioned through the window. A tone of exasperation. She always stays too long. She acts like it's her house. I stood still for a moment, dish in hand, listening to voices that once leaned on me now sigh at the mention of my name. I left the dish on the porch. They never brought it back. That summer, they went to the beach. For 2 weeks. I found out when I offered to bring over fresh figs from the market and got an automated reply. We're out of town. I stared at the message for a long while. I remembered the summer I took my son to that same beach, back when he was 5. How he cried because his sandals got swept away in the tide. How I carried him the whole walk back. Even when my shoes filled with sand, they came back sunburnt and smiling. They never mentioned. They'd been away and I stopped asking because every question I asked made me feel smaller. Did you get my message? Were you out of town? Did you need anything? Eventually, I learned not to ask, not out of pride, but out of preservation. There's only so many times you can offer yourself before you start to disappear in the giving. I sat in there, living room one evening, this was just months before that sentence, and realized I hadn't touched a single thing in the house that was mine. The blanket on the sofa was new. The mugs in the cabinet had changed. Even the picture frames had been replaced with glossy, professional portraits. I wasn't in any of them. They hadn't removed me on purpose, but they hadn't remembered Kay either. And there's a kind of grief in being left behind so gently, so gradually. It feels like your absence was always meant to be. It was a Sunday afternoon when I found the ad. I was sitting in the corner of the cafe by the pharmacy, sipping a lukewarm cup of tea, trying to keep myself busy while waiting for a refill on my blood pressure medication. The place was quiet, soft jazz overhead, a breeze from the open door, and the newspaper curled in half on the table, and there it was. Right there in the classified section, under available now. Guest suite for rent, private entrance. Newly renovated, ideal for long-term stay. The address listed was my son's house. My old home. The same guest suite that, until just a few months earlier, still had my quilt folded at the foot of the bed. The one with the slanted ceiling, and the lamp I had bought from the Sunday market, now for rent. I stared at the ad, not moving, my fingers pressed into the table's edge. I read it again and again, as if it might change. They hadn't mentioned it. There was no call, no check-in. "No, Mom, we're thinking of renting out the space. Are you all right with that?" Case, I wasn't part of the equation anymore. That space wasn't mine. That quilt wasn't mine. That home, the one I helped furnish, clean, and fill with the smell of baking and birthday candles, wasn't mine. I folded the newspaper slowly, placed it back on the rack, and walked out without saying a word. Outside, the air felt thick. My hands shook slightly, but I couldn't be sure whether it was from anger, humiliation, or disbelief. I didn't confront them. I didn't call. What was there to say? They had already communicated clearly, using the language of silence. I walked for an hour. I strolled past the park where I had fond memories of pushing my grandson on the swings. I walked past the corner shop where I had previously purchased popsicles for my grandson after school. I once sat on a bench anticipating my son's arrival for an unfulfilled dinner. He'd forgotten. I'd said it was fine. Always fine, I ended. Up back at my small apartment, the one I hadn't yet let go of, though they insisted I didn't need both places. Thank God I hadn't listened. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around. My own books, my teacup, my quiet, my things. That evening, I went online and checked the rental listing myself. Photos of the room, the lamp I'd picked, the frame I had painted soft blue dot in one image. I spotted my old knitted cushion on the bench by the window, the same one I used to lean against while watching the garden bloom in spring. It had all been left scrubbed, photographed, and packaged for someone else to live inside. And me. No mention, no message, no memory. That was the moment I stopped hoping they'd come back to themselves. That was the moment I realized this wasn't a drift. It was a decision. They had chosen convenience. They had chosen tenants. They had chosen to profit off a space that once held my presence, and in doing so, they drew a line so clear I could feel it underfoot. From that moment on, I stopped standing on the porch of their life, waiting to be let back in. I turned the key in the lock of my own place and knew I was done. I didn't announce it. There was no message, no dramatic goodbye, and no final conversation meant to make anyone feel guilty. I just stopped. Stopped calling. Stopped texting. Stopped reminding. Stopped offering. It wasn't out of spite. It was something quieter than that, a stillness that grew in me once I realized I'd been trying to stay in a place I had already been written out of. People talk about going silent like it's a punishment. But for me, it was survival. I had poured myself into their life like water into a cracked glass, always refilling, always wondering why it never felt full now. I let the glass stay empty, and in doing so, I heard myself again. At first, the silence felt strange. My mornings used to start with a message. "How are you feeling today, ma'am?" Even if it came hours after sunrise. My hand still reached for the phone automatically, still scrolled past their names like muscle memory. But over time, that urge quieted. I stopped looking at the family group thread, stopped scrolling through their photos. I even muted their accounts, so I wouldn't see their lives pass by me like a moving train I'd been pushed off of. I went to the library again. I signed out cookbooks I never had time to read before. I found recipes that didn't require me to adjust for their preferences. No dairy-free this or low-salt that, just what I liked. I cooked for one, ate slowly. I bought new sheets. I hung my own photos, ones of friends, of landscapes, of moments. That made me smile, and I started saving properly. Quietly, each week I tucked a little away, not for them, not for emergencies, for a life that was mine alone to shape. I even called a solicitor. We sat at a round table in a quiet office with cream-colored walls and a ticking clock that made me feel like time was something I could hold again. She asked if I wanted to make changes to my will. I did. We talked through it slowly, She asked questions with care. I answered with a steadiness that surprised me. I made decisions not out of revenge, not to shock anyone, but because I wanted my legacy, whatever modest form it took, to land in the hands of those who saw me. I removed names, added others, charities, a neighbor who had always checked on me, a friend who once brought soup when I was sick. Unasked. No family. No family. Not anymore. The silence grew into something sacred, not loneliness-solitude. I stopped waiting for birthdays to be remembered. I planned my own. I stopped checking the mail for cards that never came. I wrote one to myself instead, a small note tucked into a drawer that simply said, "You are not invisible. Not here." And IWASN single quotes. Not on my quiet cottage. Not on my walks to the market. Not in the sound of my own voice as I read aloud to no one at all. Just because I liked the sound of stories filling a room again. They didn't notice at first. That was the hardest part. But it confirmed what I already knew, that my presence had been optional in their world for a very long time. And now, my absence would have to teach them what my voice could not. There's something strange about waking up one morning and realizing your life belongs to you again. At first, it feels like guilt. You cook what you want. In fact, you feel a pang as if someone else should be fed first. You sit in the sun for too long. And you wonder if you've forgotten an appointment that was never yours to begin with. But then, slowly, that guilt unknots itself. And what takes its place is a kind of quiet permission. That's how I began moving. Differently. It started with the smallest thing. I painted the front door of my flat. A soft green, not bold, not loud. Just mine. I bought a bird feeder for the balcony rail. Took the sparrows less than a day to find it. Every morning now, they visit, loud, chatty, chaotic, canned. I sit with my tea and smile at how freely they arrive. No invitation. No fear of overstaying. I rearranged the living room, not for function, for pleasure. I moved the chair to the window. I placed the lamp near the floor cushion where I now read each night. I unpacked boxes I'd ignored for years. Boxes filled with things I thought I had to let go of because there wasn't room. Turns out there was always room, just not in their house. I even started walking, again really walking. Not the half-paced shuffle through grocery aisles, but walks that lasted an hour, sometimes more. I passed gardens with stone gnomes, laundromats that still played soft rock, through cracked windows and one bench by the park that faced east. I made it my own. On a whim, I joined a book club at the library. Just a few women, some older than me, some younger. We read slowly, drink too much tea, and talk about characters. As if they were neighbors. No one asked about my family. And for once, I was grateful, because I was learning how to be someone outside of them. For my birthday, you're my 72nd, I bought myself a cake. Lemon, my favorite. I didn't throw a party. I didn't wait for calls. I set the cake. On the table, poured a glass of wine, and lit a single candle. And I said aloud in the quiet of my own home, "You made it. And you're still here." It wasn't grand, but it was the most honest celebration I'd had in years. I made a list that night, not a bucket list. It's just a small list of things I'd never done because I was always waiting to be needed. A trip to the coast, a pottery class. It's a letter to myself. I started with the coast. 2 days in a small inn overlooking the sea. The room smelled of salt and old pine. I took long walks along the shoreline and watched the tide smooth out the sand, like breath over glass. No one knew where I was, and for the first time I didn't feel forgotten. I felt free. I brought back a shell from that trip, small, cracked, but beautiful in its own way. I placed it on my nightstand, a reminder that broken things can still be whole. And from that day on, I moved differently. Not to be seen, not to be appreciated, but simply to be. I didn't disappear from their lives like a slammed door. I became something. Quieter, a light they forgot to turn off. A drawer they didn't open until something went missing. At first, I don't think they noticed. The silence probably felt like a relief. No reminders, no check-ins, no would you like me to babysit, or I brought some groceries by. I imagine the guest suite was rented quickly. The ad had a waiting list. It always does when the photos are just right. Someone else moved into the space that once held my books, my blanket, and my extra reading glasses. Someone who didn't know I had once sewn the curtains in that room by hand, double-lined so the baby wouldn't wake in the afternoon sun. I wonder if they ever found the pressed flower I had left between the pages of a book on the shelf. Probably not. They likely boxed everything and stored it without much thought. But time, as always, has a way of unraveling our arrangements. I heard from a neighbor that the renters moved out after a few months. They said the space didn't feel like theirs. She told me gently, as if she knew not to linger on the sentence. Her tone said more than her words. I nodded. I didn't smile, because I knew some rooms hold memory in the walls. And when you fill them with strangers, the quiet becomes unsettling. From what I've gathered, bits overheard at the post office, passing comments at the market, things began to strain. My grandson struggled at school. He missed deadlines. He came withdrawn. He used to talk to me, you know. He once told me he liked how my house smelled like cinnamon and rain now. I doubt he even remembers. My daughter-in-law started spending weekends at her sister's. My son took more night shifts. They grew tired, stretched thin, not from a single cause, but from 1,000 small tasks they had always quietly handed to me. The glue was no longer present. The quiet coordination was no longer present. The food was ready before anyone asked for it. The bills that were double-checked. The Band-Aids were in the drawer where they always were. They began to feel my absence not in an announcement, but in the friction of ordinary life. Even the holidays lost their rhythm. The year I stopped showing up, they hosted Christmas alone. No one brought the ham. They forgot the cranberry sauce. The decorations were put up late and taken down early. I heard all of this from someone else. They never told me pride is strange like that, but I didn't feel victorious. I felt calm because for the first time, they were learning the difference between someone being around and someone holding everything together I had never asked for. Credit. Never needed applause. But I had mattered, and now, in my absence, that truth stood quietly in the spaces I used to fill. I stayed away, not to punish, but to protect the peace I had found from afar. I could see them learning, slowly, stumbling, even, and that was theirs to do. I watched from the edges, not as a ghost, but as a woman who had finally stepped out of the frame and into her own light. It took me longer than I expected to start writing it. Not because I didn't know what to say, had words stacked inside me like untouched boxes in a forgotten attic, but because I wasn't sure who I was writing it for. For weeks, I sat with a blank piece of stationery tucked inside a drawer, the kind with deckled edges and the faint scent of lavender, the last of a box I'd been saving for something important. And then, one morning, after washing the dishes and drying my hands on a tea towel with faded violets, I opened the drawer, took out the paper, and began. It started without a salutation. No, dear. No name. Just a single line. You deserved better, and I'm sorry you had to wait this long to hear it. The letter was to me, not to my son, not to my grandson, not to the woman I had once called family through gritted teeth and quiet endurance. It was for the version of myself who had stood in hallways unheard, who had packed overnight bags without complaint, who had smiled through being erased. I wrote to her like she was someone I hadn't seen in years. I told her how proud I was of her for surviving what no one saw, for biting her tongue when words would have only been met with eye rolls, for showing up with cakes and casseroles and clean laundry when no one had the decency to say thank you. I told her she was never too much, never a burden, and never in the way. She had been an anchor, and they had simply learned to treat the weight as background noise. I wrote about the day I left, how I hadn't planned it, how it wasn't a rebellion but a resignation, a quiet, final drawing of the curtain. I told her she had made the right choice, that she hadn't abandoned anyone, she had simply stopped abandoning herself. I wrote, you waited for them to notice, and when they didn't, you walked away with your dignity intact. That was not weakness. That was strength without spectacle. And then I wrote something I hadn't known I needed to say. You are allowed to be loved without earning it every single day. That line made me pause. I stared at the page, the pen still in my hand, my heart heavy, with the truth of it, because that had always been the root of it, hadn't it? I had believed, deep down, that love was something I had to work for, through service, through silence, through staying small. They could stretch. I'd told myself that one day they'd look back and realize what I had done for them, the ways I had filled every crack before it could widen. But that day never came, and now I was done waiting, in that moment. At the little desk by the window where the light filtered through sheer curtains, I wrote the final paragraph. You are free now. Free to let go of their version of you. Free to breathe without permission. Free to grow in a direction that doesn't bend toward their comfort. You are still here, and that is your triumph. I signed the letter without a name because it belonged to every version of me, the young mother who skipped dinner to feed her son, the older woman who sat quietly on the sofa while others made decisions, and the woman who now drank tea alone and finally tasted its warmth. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into an envelope. I didn't seal it. Instead, I placed it in the drawer next to my journal, not to send, not to bury, but to honor. It didn't need to go anywhere, because what changed wasn't them. It was me. That letter was a marker, a quiet gravestone for the woman who had once believed love meant disappearing for others. She had been kind, loyal, constant, but it also been exhausted, unseen, whittled down to the helpful presence in the background. Now I was more, not louder, not harder, just fuller. Later that evening, I lit a candle and read the letter aloud. Just once. Not for drama, but because I needed to hear it in my own voice. I let the words land in the air, soft and slow, each one settling around the room like dust. And when I was done, I sat still, not crying, not grieving, just breathing. It was a breath that felt fresh, the kind of breath that tells you something old has finally released its hold on your ribs. That night I slept deeply. No dreams. I did not wake up at 3 a.m. with invisible weights on my chest. Woke up to birdsong and the smell of rosemary from the pot on my windowsill, and I knew that letter would never be mailed, but it had already. The days begin slowly now. There's no alarm. There's no need to prepare breakfast for anyone else. No one is in need of a ride, a favor, or a reminder. I rise when the light softens the curtain edges. I sit with my tea in the chair that looks out over the street, where the neighbors' cat occasionally strolls by like it owns the block. And I breathe. Not the shallow breaths of someone waiting for her name to be called, but full ones, the kind that reach your stomach and make your shoulders drop. My life is quiet, not empty. Speak quiet. People sometimes think quietness is the same as loneliness. That if you're not surrounded by noise, by visitors, by laughter, by a full house, you must be aching for it. But this silence isn't aching. It's earned. I walk most days. There's a small path behind the bakery that leads to a garden square the tourists never find. There is a single bench situated beneath a copper beech tree. That's where I sit and watch the world pass by in pieces, children with 2 big backpacks, elderly couples walking arm in arm, dogs pulling against leads with more energy than sense. Sometimes I bring a book. Sometimes I just listen. The air carries the scent of fresh bread and late-season lilacs, and no one interrupts. There's a soft grace in being uninterrupted for most of my life. I was always on alert, ready to help, to fix, to comfort. I was someone's everything, his mother, her helper, the go-between, the buffer. Now, I'm just myself, and it's enough. I've made small friendships here and there. Margaret from the book club stops by on Thursdays. We exchange recipes we never really follow. The boy from the flower shop waves when I passed. He once gave me a sprig of eucalyptus just because. I dried it and placed it in a vase on my shelf. Little gestures. Small kindnesses. No grand declarations. No obligations. I like it that way. I journal every evening, all right? Just a few lines every evening. I write, not about what I've done, but about how I've felt. It's new for me. For so long, I lived in reaction to other people's needs. Now, I ask myself questions like, what brought you peace today? What did you notice? What do you want to remember? Yesterday I wrote, the light came through the window just right, and I didn't feel lonely. I just felt here. That's become my compass. A here-ness of things. Being present in my life. Not waiting to be pulled into someone else's. I think about my son occasionally. Not often. I don't think about him as frequently as I used to. Feeling a desperate ache and a flickering hope that he might call or ask. Now it's more like watching the shape of a hill you once climbed. You remember the effort, the view, and the stumbles, but you no longer feel the need to go back up it. He sent a message once, months after the last word passed between us. I hope you're well. That was it. No question. No invitation. And I didn't respond, because by then I had nothing left to explain. I wasn't angry. I was just finished. Some endings come with fanfare. Others just settle, like dust. It's like a sigh you didn't know you were holding. I'm not bitter. That surprises people. They expect bitterness from women like me, the ones who were given less than they deserved. But bitterness is heavy. I wanted lightness, so I let it all go. Not because they said sorry, not because they changed, but because I refused to spend the last stretch of my life waiting at a door that never opened. I planted herbs on my windowsill. Basil, thyme, mint. I bought a hat I didn't need wide-brimmed with a ribbon I tied loosely under my chin. Wore it on a walk and didn't care who saw. I baked a cake for myself on a quiet Sunday afternoon. No occasion, just because. I listened to old jazz while it cooled and danced barefoot across the kitchen tiles. No one clapped. No one commented. N. Still, it was enough. That's what I've come to learn, that the life I was always hoping someone would build around me, I was allowed to build for myself. It's not crowded. It doesn't sparkle, but it's mine. There's an old photograph I keep on my shelf. Me and my son when he was small, maybe 6. He's laughing, mid-movement, mouth open wide. I'm holding his hand. Sometimes I look at it and smile. With sadness? Not with longing. Just with respect for the woman in that photo. The one who gave everything. She was strong. But this version of me sitting here, to cooling, light fading across the floor, she is strong too. She just holds that strength. Differently now. Quieter, gentler, rooted.